I'm the Deputy Administrator here at ODFW for inland fisheries, so hatcheries are within my program. Really want to say thank you to you all for being here today, and thanks to those folks that are online. Today is really the start of a process that's going to extend through summer with the goal of charting a more sustainable path for our hatchery system. So we've got a lot of information we want to share with you over the next month, a lot of discussions we want to have. And today's really about setting the stage for that. So I do want to get into what that process will look like a little later, but first we need to kind of set the stage for why we're doing this now, what the need is, what your role can be in this, and what we're looking to get out of it. And then also at the outset, I just want to acknowledge that probably the agency recommended budget is on a lot of your minds. In that budget, we had proposed not funding 2 hatchery facilities next biennium. And just keep in mind that these are 2 parallel processes that we're on that are somewhat related, right? Every 2 years, we have to prepare an agency budget. And this year, we're in the unfortunate circumstance where our expenditures were just exceeding our revenue. And so we had to, in addition to making some proposed revenue increases, propose some reductions in program. So we've kind of put that proposal out there. It's got a long way to go. It's got to go through the governor's office and the legislature. So a lot of room for discussion about what's in that package and what might be tweaked or changed. And then in parallel to that, we're going to be talking quite at length about the hatchery system and what we can do to make it more sustainable. And at some point next year, while we're in session, those 2 things will merge. And whatever comes out of this process with you all could impact the recommendations that we make or go through in the budget. So I just say there's a lot more ground to cover, a lot more runway here for these discussions, and what's in the ARB at the moment may not be what comes out in the end. So before we dive into some background on this, I just want to hand it over to Willamette Partnership for a minute to go through the agenda. So we've contracted with Willamette Partnership, who do a lot of work on natural resource discussions, to help us facilitate this process through this summer. So I'm going to hand it over to them to let you know how this is going to go today.
Good morning. I am Teresa Jacobs. I work with Willamette Partnership, and this is...
Hi, I'm Kellen. I'm gonna have to be on my tippy toes. I'm Kellen Baez. I work with Willamette Partnership as well.
We're going to tell you a little bit about Willamette Partnership and our role later on in the presentation, but we just wanted to do a quick overview of the day and some of the stuff that's around the room so that you all know what we're doing. We're going to see if we can advance the slides. One slide. Is there an agenda? Will you just grab it? While they're figuring that out, I'll just go ahead and use a paper agenda. So first thing, for people in the room, there is a paper agenda either on your seat or nearby. ODFW is going to speak first. We're going to have a question and answer session, and then Willamette Partnership is going to speak, and we'll have another question and answer session. There are quite a few people on the phone. Oh, there you go. So that's perfect. Thank you. We're going to go back and forth when we do those Q&A sessions between the room and the phone to make sure, or the teams to make sure that people are able to participate even from a distance. And if we do not get to all of the questions in the room or online, we are going to record the questions and answer them and publish those answers. So for people in the room, if you look back at these 2 posts, there are little bright colored stickies and pens. We will give you a reminder at about the 5 minutes left mark in the Q&A portion to say, if you haven't gotten to ask your question, go ahead and write it down and give it to us on one of those stickies. And for the folks who are online, we have a colleague that is helping us, Emily. So you just write your question into the chat and we will make sure that that question is captured and responded to so you can see those answers in case we don't have enough time to go through all of it here. There is coffee in the back of the room for folks who are here. And otherwise, I think we're good to go.
Thanks, Teresa. If we could go forward again. So yeah, getting into a little bit of background about the hatchery system. So ODFW operates about 33 hatchery facilities, and we have some satellites in addition to that. 14 of those hatchery facilities are state-owned, and those are the ones in red here. And then 18 are federally owned. So most of the state facilities are generally on the west side of the state. We have a few down the Cascades. And most of the federal facilities are in the Willamette Basin, Columbia Basin, and then in the Rogue. And the size of the circle there just corresponds to how much production is coming out of each facility. So you see that a lot of production concentrated out of Rogue, for example, at Coal Rivers, the Willamette, and the Columbia Basin. We do have a facility that's owned by PGE at Round Butte, which was a mitigation facility put in place for Round Butte Dam. I think it's also important to note that each of these facilities operates a number of programs, and a program just being a collection of, or a species and stock of fish that are released in the same location. And we have a number of these hatcheries that produce programs for basins that the hatchery is not located in. Some good examples being like the Chetco, where we have a full Chinook program and a winter steelhead program, or the Silettes, where we have a winter steelhead program and a summer steelhead program, even though there's no hatchery in that basin. Can we go next? So the purpose of these hatchery programs varies, but it's really linked to the health of the wild populations. And so the characteristics of that program will vary. On the left there, where we have these very depressed wild populations, or maybe even extirpated, we have these conservation programs that run our hatcheries. So good examples there is like Northeast Oregon, where we have some spring Chinook programs in the Grand Ronde, for example, that are really trying to supplement the wild populations that are really depressed and give us time to work on some of the factors that are causing that depression, like the hydro system. Another example is like the Willamette, where we have these high head dams that have blocked 60 to 80% of the habitat. There we're using hatchery fish out of the Willamette hatcheries to stock above those dams to try and get some natural production going. And then you're probably familiar, recently we started a hatchery conservation program down the Coquille because of the impacts that smallmouth bass are having on the full Chinook there. So those are examples of conservation programs. Then when we have areas where wild fish are more healthy and can potentially sustain some level of harvest, we also have hatchery programs because the demand for harvest exceeds what those wild populations can support. Mostly that occurs on the coast. There are some instances outside the coast, but generally that's where you'll find those harvest augmentation programs. And then in some locations, we do have wild populations that can support robust harvest opportunities. Generally, you might think of full Chinook on the coast in a lot of basins. A lot of the full Chinook harvest on the coast, 70 to 80% is of wild fish. And a couple of locations there that come to mind are like Alsea and Silettes. Then we have this third category of program, which is mitigation, which you might hear a lot. And I think most of you are familiar with that, but it's really where we've had large-scale projects that have impacted habitat. A lot of these times this is a dam. So good examples are again on the Willamette. We've got those high head dams, but also on the Columbia Basin and then the Rogue. And these have oftentimes been federal actions to construct dams, but they can also be like Pelton Round Butte or other smaller instances like Galesville down in the Umpqua. In those cases, whoever is responsible for those structures is required to mitigate for the impact of those structures on the fish and fishery. And so we run some large-scale mitigation programs on behalf of the federal government in the Willamette and the Columbia Basin. And those can range from, again, being harvest augmentation to a combination of conservation and harvest. A good example, again, being in the Willamette, where we have the same hatchery program being both harvest augmentation, providing opportunity in the Willamette and Lower Columbia and offshore, but also being used to stock outplant fish above the dams for conservation purposes and try and reestablish populations up there. Next. So recognizing all those different purposes, it's also, I think, important to understand that the hatchery system itself is really important socially, culturally, and economically in Oregon. These hatcheries produce about 35 million salmon and steelhead a year, about 5 million trout. And although a number of our anglers are not necessarily wanting to harvest fish, for those that do harvest fish, hatcheries are an incredibly important source for that harvest opportunity, constituting about 70% of the harvested fish in Oregon for salmon steelhead and closer to 90% for trout. So a really important system. Next. But one that's not without challenges. So a lot of these facilities were built in the 1950s. And as we all know, with national infrastructure, roads and what have you, water system supplies, those systems are degrading. And we've got a pretty significant deferred maintenance backlog at our hatchery facilities. A lot of the concrete raceways are in need of repair. A lot of the facilities themselves have some issues. So that's the deferred maintenance side of things. Then also, I think you're aware that you've been experiencing increased costs because of inflation. And the same way our hatchery system has been experiencing that. The last couple of biennia, we've seen 20% biennial increases in fish food, for example. And fish food's a big portion of the S&S, supplies and services budget for these hatcheries. In addition, power is going up, and some of these facilities require power for pumping, and that's been a big increase in expenses. And then personnel costs have also gone up. So we've got the situation where we've got a lot of increasing costs and flat funding, both state, federal, and license. And so that's kind of, you're seeing that play out in our budget process as well, but it's also impacting hatcheries, which are a really big portion of our agency budget. So about 87 million of Fish Division's 220 million budget is focused on hatcheries. Then climate change is also, or changing climate is also kind of impacting the system in a big way. Obviously, this is a picture of Rock Creek, which burned in the 2020 Archie Creek fire. But we've been impacted, the whole system's been impacted by fire, particularly since 2017. You remember the Eagle Creek fire in the gorge? That caused us to evacuate some facilities, and we had to move fish out of there into the Willamette Basin. We've had fires every year since then, and 2020 was the most significant. We had 5 hatcheries that were impacted, had to evacuate. One that was destroyed, Klamath Hatch House, was also destroyed, and others that were impacted in the Willamette Basin. And then even just last year, Elk Creek Hatchery down on the south coast came within a whisker's breadth of being burned down. And these are kind of the most significant impact. When we lose a hatchery, it can take years to rebuild. We're still in the process of negotiating with Pacific Power and FEMA for insurance monies for Rock Creek and Klamath. So it can take years to work through that process. And in the meantime, the rest of your system is being kind of strained to absorb that capacity. And then some of the other things that we're seeing is increasing temperatures and decreasing flows. And this is really impacting, when we're rearing cold water fish and we have temperatures that are 70, 80 degrees during summer, that's really not great for rearing salmon, steelhead, and trout. So all these things coming together really put us at a tipping point in order to continue to maintain the system and build something that's resilient. We're looking to be proactive, collect some information, work with you all, and figure out how we can adapt and invest in the system going forward. Next. So we started this process back in 2020 after the fires, kind of recognized that this was going to be something we needed to look at. So we started collecting information on the economics, on the climate vulnerability of the system, and also on the current state of the system. Next. And then we were fortunate through the legislative session last year to get some additional resources in the form of $1 million from the state legislature. They recognized the importance of this system and also that the pressures it was under. And this $1 million has really helped us accelerate the pace of our information collection and to be able to work with you all over the next few months. So as a result of that, we've been able to issue 7 contracts. So the legislature directed us to procure third-party assessments for a variety of things. We've issued 7 contracts to fulfill that obligation. One is looking at the economics of the system in terms of funding model, financial sustainability, and the costs and benefits of it. Second one is looking at how these facilities are staying good neighbors to wild fish in terms of how the best available science is incorporated into planning and policies. And then a really big focus on climate vulnerability. So 5 contracts issued there. They're looking at how we expect climate change to impact the facilities themselves, how we and what we might do to minimize that vulnerability. Looking at how climate change might impact the species and stocks we're rearing. So we know, for example, that coho are doing quite well right now, whereas summer steelhead perhaps are not doing so well. And it's the same for our wild fish and our hatchery fish, and we know that's going to continue into the future. So We know that we might need to change the programs we have, so we want to understand which of these programs are going to do well and which are going to be problematic. And then also we want to develop some recommendations to mitigate all these impacts. So we've got some contracts out there that are looking to bring all this information together and assess either what it'll look like to invest in all the facilities we currently have, or look at a different model, not looking to reduce production, but how might we maintain that production in a different way that's more sustainable and resilient. Next. So the outcome of this really is going to be two things. One's a report to the legislature next year, and the other is an infrastructure blueprint. That infrastructure blueprint is what will guide department investments and priorities in this system for the next couple of decades. So in addition to all the information we've collected, we're hoping that you all will engage with us, and we're also working separately with the tribes in Oregon to ensure that those perspectives are incorporated into our recommendations. And then we're going to be pursuing some investments in this facility going forward with the legislature. What we're looking for in the end is a system that we can be proud of, one that we can use to maximize fishery opportunity while still being good neighbors to wild fish, and one that is sustainable for us, one that we can continue to operate in the future. Next. In terms of your role here, the focus for these discussions is really going to be on the state system, the state-owned system, so there's 14 hatchery facilities. We do recognize that there are some interdependencies with some of the federal facilities like Coal Rivers and Leeburg, where fish are moved into there for rearing and then moved back to state facilities. So that will be a part of the discussion, but really it's going to be focused on the state hatchery system because that's where we have some control over what we do with it. We will be gathering information on the federal system, but we'll be using that separately to work with our federal delegation and federal agency partners to look for investments in those systems. And we're already seeing some of that through the recent IRA. There's been about 20 million invested in gorge facilities and potentially more through the USV Oregon process. We're going to be looking for feedback from you all on what does and doesn't make sense in terms of investing in the system, given all the information that we're going to share in the next month or so. And then just recognizing that there are different perspectives on hatcheries and hatchery fish. I know it, you all know it. We're not expecting there to be consensus out of this process, but to the extent that there can be some agreement on some solutions, those solutions will have more influence in our recommendations going forward. Next. So in terms of the timeline, Willamette Partnership is going to outline a bit more of the detail here, but broadly, we're looking at some webinars in August 1st, 8th, and 15th to share some information. So we've been contracting with these third parties over the last 6 months. They're due to deliver us some products in the coming month or so. We'll be looking to turn those around into sharing information in the webinars, and we'll also post those reports online so you can see the full detail. Then we'll pull everyone back together for a public meeting similar to this in late August. And I think there's going to be a poll go out soon to look for dates for that. And then we're going to use a series of small and large group meetings in kind of September, October to really kind of dive into that information and look collectively at what might make sense going forward. And then we'll wrap up all that information and keeping in mind that parallel to that, we'll also be working with the 9 tribes in Oregon. We'll be working on a report to the state legislature in kind of November, December, delivering that in January, February. In addition, we've got our budget process that I mentioned earlier. They'll be proceeding along a separate track, but somewhat related, right? So that'll be coming together in the next legislative session between January and June next year. So a lot of work to do over the next few months. I am really hopeful that we can find some innovative solutions here, that we can put our system back on a sustainable footing and make it resilient going forward. It's a big challenge. You're going to see some numbers that are going to water your eyes, but I think we can get there. So I am going to stop there and just kind of take any questions on the process or kind of what we're hoping to achieve.
So I introduced myself earlier, but I'll reintroduce myself now that we're getting into our portion of the presentation. I'm Teresa Jacobs. I work with Willamette Partnership, and this is Kellen Bias. She also works with Willamette Partnership. And our part in this process that you're hearing about is very focused on helping the agency develop a process and engage with you all in a way that allows for the very diverse perspectives in the room to be heard. So success for us looks like creating a process where all of the voices in the room and also on the phone have an avenue to communicate their perspectives and their concerns back to the agency, and where we can facilitate productive dialogue between folks to identify solutions to share back with the department. And so, as you heard, ODFW is working obviously working to achieve a more sustainable and resilient hatchery system, but specifically working with tribes, considering biology, and considering public input to do that work. So we are helping them get the information needed for the infrastructure blueprint. That's what they're calling it. That infrastructure blueprint will guide the agency's decisions on policy and on investment. So we are not going to write policy together, which should be a huge sigh of relief for everyone, but we are going to talk about the issues and the levers and the topics that we hope the agency will use to inform its policy and investments. We're going to talk about the interview process and what we learned. I want to let you know we have already heard very diverse perspectives from the folks that we talked to, and we haven't even talked to all of the perspectives, folks holding all the perspectives that are probably in the room and on the phone. We are prepared to hear diverse perspectives throughout the process. And as Sean said, and we agree, we don't have time or inclination to try to convert folks' ideologies or to come up with a single truth about the hatchery system. That's not our goal here. Our goal is to help find solutions that are palatable to folks with different beliefs about the hatchery system. So that is what we are here to do. And we'll tell you a little bit more about Willamette Partnership. Some of you might be familiar with our work and others may not be familiar with our work.
Yeah, so hi folks, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Willamette Partnership and who we are. We are a nonprofit that has been in the natural resources space for 20 years. We provide technical assistance to communities, agencies, and organizations that intersect nature and people or natural resources. Could be agriculture, could be water. In this case, it's fish. And the technical assistance we provide the most is facilitation, and that is what we're doing here with ODFW. So we are helping design a process. We are not doing the assessment. We are here to assist on the public engagement. And our role is a neutral facilitator. We don't have an agenda. We live in the aisle, and we're working toward shared outcomes and facilitating those discussions. And with that, I'll kick it back to Teresa.
Okay, so we're going to dive into what we learned in the interviews, and I'm going to do most of the presenting. Kellen is going to chime in with her perspectives. And just to give you a little bit of sort of the full view, including the folks on the phone. So Kellen and I did the interviews together, but we have two other colleagues who are supporting us. One is on the phone right now, Emily Irish, sort of tracking the chat and helping us keep up with that part. And the other is our colleague Naomi, who is sort of the operations and details behind the scenes. So you might hear those names, receive emails from those folks, or see them in the process. We work together as a team. Next slide. So the interviews, I see familiar faces in the room. I know that some of you participated in the interviews, so you know how this went. But what we did in this process is interview 10 groups who the department identified who have a statewide view of the hatchery system and often interact with the department regarding that view. And because we have limited time here to collect input and report back to the legislature, we just chose a sample of organizations. So we chose 10 out of, I'm sure, hundreds of folks who are interested in this process. And when we're doing that, we're just looking for a cross-section of ideas and perspectives that people have that helps us get our arms around where there might be a potential for collaboration and where there are going to be views that are fairly different. And so that's what we were doing. We held the interviews virtually. They were 1 hour, and you can see the long list of acronyms. For anybody who doesn't know the acronyms, I can tell you real quickly: the American Sport Fishing Association, Native Fish Society, Association of Northwest Steelheaders, Trout Unlimited, Coast Conservation Alliance, Wild Salmon Center, the Conservation Angler, Northwest Guides and Anglers Association, Oregon Anglers Alliance, and the Northwest Sport Fishing Industry Association. So that's who we spoke to. I also want to let you know that we use the word angler and fisher or fishing interchangeably. We mean that to be the broadest understanding of all of the folks in this state who fish. So you'll hear that throughout the process. We don't mean to exclude anybody who is fishing. We asked questions that were focused on your organization or association's perspective on hatcheries, your recommendations. And then we also asked a bunch of questions that had to do with your past history of collaboration and any insights you can offer about how to foster an environment that would be productive for collaboration. The purpose we've sort of covered. It was to collect your insights to inform the process. Obviously, this process has time and constraints. We are thankful for the legislature's budget to engage in this process, but as you know, anytime you engage the public, you could spend years and years doing that and sort of an endless amount of budget, and we're trying to get this done in a relatively short period of time. Let's see. Next slide. We wanted to start the whole conversation. I'm going to switch into what we learned through these interviews by identifying some common ground, because there was a lot of it. And this slide sort of begins to explain where we saw some common ground. I'll start, and I wouldn't usually read slides, but because I want to make sure people can see the information in the room or hear it, I'm going to go ahead and do it this time for this slide. So the first bit of common ground was recognizing that climate change is a factor and adaptation is needed. So adaptation is necessary from hatchery location to best management practices. Fish of all origins are affected. We heard this feedback in all of the interviews that we conducted, a recognition that we need to work together, and everybody recognizes the need to adapt hatchery practices and hatchery infrastructure to mitigate the effects of climate change. Our second point of common ground was innovation and partnerships. There was a recognition that one agency cannot do it all, and a call for out-of-the-box external partnerships to accomplish more common goals in this complex system. So we heard a lot about partnerships, innovation, and collaboration as essential to advancing hatchery management practices, improving efficiency, and achieving conservation outcomes. We heard some interviewees suggested innovative technologies, others focused on partnerships and approaches to emerging challenges, habitat degradation, and disease prevention. Either way, regardless of where you were focused, there was a call for more innovation and more partnership. Number three, which we heard a lot about, is education. While not all Oregonians buy a fishing license, there was a belief that Oregonians should have access and opportunity to understand fish, wild or hatchery fish. And we heard this across the board. We heard very specific ideas, which we're going to dive into in a little bit, but I think the point of common reflection is that there is a critical need to raise awareness around hatchery issues and wild fish. We heard a lot of support for hatchery workers, hatchery initiatives, and we heard a lot of support for sort of a more holistic discussion about the full system in the public eye, including what the agency is doing and how they interact with the public. There's even more common ground. We heard across the board that wild fish are important to all of the interviewees that we spoke with. Wild fish are critically important to Oregon's rivers, and they're also critically important to raising hatchery fish. We heard that fish abundance is important to everybody that we spoke to. Oregonians rely on fish being in streams, fish feed economies and ecosystems, and there are cultural identities and values associated with fish. So we were, hearing sort of over and over again, both about the cultural relevance of fish and fishing and angling, and also the sort of ecosystem relevance of wild fish. So both sides. We heard a lot about collaboration and compromise. Most of the folks we talked to would rather be fishing than talking to us. And some even suggested that fishing with each other would be fun. What we heard a lot was that folks would like more opportunities for collaboration that would help good decision making. And that's what we're hoping to do with this process. I would say not all of the folks that we talked to were sure about how to get that done, and that's why we're here and we're going to help. But folks did have examples of collaboration that had worked in the past. And so we're hoping that using that model, we can move forward and do this work together. Kellen, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add that when we heard about the desire for more collaboration, it was also outside of these legislative session years, where we're not looking at something that's coming up, but just through normal short session, long session, doesn't matter, just a need to get together so that it's not always so tense at a given moment.
Thanks, Callan. So not surprisingly, there were also some challenges that we identified through the interviews. The first challenge we identified is hatchery effectiveness. While there was agreement on some success stories, we heard a lot about Lonesome Larry, there were differing views on long-term impacts of hatcheries on fish, which is probably not a surprise to anyone in the room or on the phone. Climate change. So you saw that in the sort of slides about common ground. There was common ground about the need for adaptation, but there were some pretty notable differences about climate change implementation and how you would go about adapting to climate change. So there were multiple perspectives on the approach and the prioritization strategies for that. Funding and policy advocacy, everybody was aligned on a need for policy change. Folks recognize that there is inadequate funding, but there was a big difference on how funding and policy challenges should be addressed. And sort of this, to summarize the difference, there was much focus in some instances on funding hatcheries and their modernization as what needs to be done, whereas there was also in other groups a focus on reallocating funding outside of just hatchery projects, maybe to restoration projects or a broader view of the watershed. So a recognition that money is needed and a disagreement about how to spend it. I don't think so. Well, actually, one slide too far, yep. So a couple of observations that we wanted to make. First of all, there was more common ground than challenges. And not to be sort of Pollyanna-ish about it, we understand that the challenges are significant. But I think for this process, given the time constraints that we have, it can be helpful to focus on the common ground as a foundation for the work we're going to do together. I think, we have a shared value during this time of making a difference and exerting a bit of influence and guidance over the department's process. So hopefully we can focus on this opportunity to do that. And I'll just reiterate, the goal here isn't ideological consensus. We don't think that that is achievable in the short time that we have here, but we are hoping to identify a range of potential solutions and ideas that everyone who participates in these conversations can get behind and that are palatable to these groups. So we have a question. Go for it. Yeah. So the question is, you talked about the groups that you interviewed when you went through the slides, but what about conversations with the tribes? Will that be incorporated or is that separate? The tribes are sovereign nations, and so they are in government-to-government talks with the agency that are separate at this point from the process. The tribes, I believe, have been invited to participate in this process and might in the future if they choose to, but they will also have and continue to have direct conversation with the department. And sort of harking back to another question about the tribal role, I think the department is still keeping an eye on how to bring the tribal feedback into our process and share that as time goes forward and those conversations evolve. Is that a fair statement, Sean? Yeah. Okay.
So something we can see those issues with the interactors.
Yeah. So the comment is it would be helpful at some point to be able to see the tribe's focus and issues side by side with the data that we've collected here on other public perspectives. Okay. Sure, David. So the question is, in terms of the list of folks that we spoke to, David is noting that he doesn't see any commercial fishing groups on the list and didn't see any broadly focused conservation groups or ecologically focused conservation groups. The question is, did we reach out to them and they aren't participating, or will we be reaching out to them in the future? How will they be involved? The answer to that question is that, like I said, we only spoke to 10 groups for this interview phase of the process, and we'll go into more detail about this later. This is a process that has interviews, and then we're having these larger group format conversations, and then we anticipate having smaller group conversations as well. The invite list, for these broader conversations is much bigger than the 10 folks that we spoke to for the interview phase. So groups that you mentioned have been invited to participate more broadly, and the department is also sharing materials about our efforts online so that anybody can look at the recordings of all of the events that are occurring and the materials that are created out of these events, like the Q&A. So we expect broad participation as we work kind of through different channels to do the work. There's also the possibility in the future, we're sort of toying with other ways to reach out, such as surveying or direct conversation. So we're paying attention to the landscape and hoping to get a broad perspective. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Why can't we hear the damn questions?
Management council and everything. That is a crucial component wanted to have in this discussion, or discussion about hatchery, specifically when that is fish that they are allocated to harvest. I think leaving them out of the initial discussion could be a real crack of trying to get to where you want to go for an inclusion or at least amiable agreements.
I'm going to repeat that for folks who can't hear online. It was a comment, just sort of an amplifying David's question to say that it is really critically important to include the views of commercial fishing in this process, and that it was potentially a miss on the interview cycle not to include the perspectives of commercial fishing early in the process. I appreciate that feedback. Okay, we're going to have a Q&A at the end too. I'm fine with questions during. We have time for that, but we'll also have space at the end. So this slide is intended to break down in a bit more detail what we heard about these areas of challenge. You see in the center, we've put the big challenges that we identified. So there's hatchery effectiveness, climate change implementation, funding and policy advocacy. Those were the big points of sort of different perspective that we heard. And then what we've done is sort of break down the types of concerns that we heard about these topics. So I'm going to start at the top. The first one that we heard was a concern about compromise. We heard a bit of feedback that compromise is difficult to achieve when you are trying to maintain your position to, pull the department in one direction or another, that groups that are comprised of multiple interests and multiple parties can sometimes have a hard time entering into compromise and getting support from their base. And so we just wanted to flag that as a concern that folks have, is how do we move forward with compromise without making the groups that you represent or the groups that you're a part of concerned that they're going to lose ground. I'm going to go around to the right. Some of these are sort of shared concerns and some of these are balancing. So in this one, we heard a lot about sustainability of fish, and we also heard about sustainability of fishing from groups. So this is, I would say this is a spectrum that we heard, where some folks are really focused on healthy fisheries. Everybody's focused on healthy fisheries for 100+ years and multiple generations, but some groups are more focused on wild fish and ecology, while other groups are more focused on angling opportunity and fish and the cultural and economic benefits of those activities in the state. Balancing local fishing expectations with concerns for habitat and fish. I think this is akin to what I was just talking about, but as we said before, Oregonians, license holders or not, expect fish to be in their streams. It's a cultural norm in this state. But there's a real sort of range of perspectives that need to be balanced as we find solutions between concerns for the habitat that fish swim in and concerns for the expectation that there be fish in the streams for harvest. And so I think, not surprisingly, that is sort of a central theme, and you're going to sort of hear it all along the right side. All of these are related ideas. Balancing fishing economics and conservation concerns. For anybody who works in the environmental movement, this is a very familiar sort of economy versus environment issue. In this case, what we heard a lot about was there is a huge economic benefit in this state associated with fishing. There are individuals who rely on fishing for their personal finances. There are communities that rely on fishing and fishing tourism for their livelihood. In And there are conservation concerns associated with hatchery operations on the other side. So how do you balance these two concerns and hear both sides at the same time? Coming around production and harvest disconnect, there was feedback that production and harvest could be more integrated and aligned, and questions about, do we know how many fish, regardless of where they come from, any given stream can carry? And so folks really wondered a little bit about how well we understand some of these systems. Trust and transparency was a huge shared challenge that everybody identified. Trust and transparency related to the agency was one point of this, and then trust and transparency as between different interested party groups was the other point of concern. We will do our best in this process to maintain as much transparency as possible. We are always open to feedback about transparency. So that is sort of, I would say, for Willamette Partnership, a real guiding principle through the process is increasing the trust of this group as between the participants and with the agency and us. Let's see. Concern over assessing costs and benefits. I think anytime you do a cost and benefit analysis, the question comes up, how will you value? So for example, in this context, we heard a lot of questions about how will the economic contributions of angling to the state of Oregon be valued? And we heard on the, on the other side, how will ecological concern and native wild fish be valued in the process? And so there's a real focus on how these issues will be prioritized as the agency undertakes a cost-benefit analysis. And I think buried in here is a real difference of opinion. There are some folks who think that investment in hatcheries is a riskier return. Like, what return do you get on your investment when you put money into modernizing hatcheries? And there are other folks who feel quite certain that modernizing operations and investing more money in hatcheries is the next best step. And so there's a difference of opinion there that's pretty important. I'm going to say, just as a final note, we plan to, as we move forward through conversations, use this as a framework. And we'll show you how in these next couple of slides for organizing our thinking around identifying solutions. But we'll also take time to ask folks what's missing, so we don't pretend to believe that this is every single concern that might exist in the room. And we will take the time to ask and build this out a bit in future conversations. Kellen? Okay. So here's what we're thinking about a way to use this. And I'm going to sort of go slower on this one. We'll go a little bit quicker on the next slide. Using education, because we heard that education was a common ground perspective, that more education is needed, but there are also pretty big differences of opinion on what we should be educating about. So how do we balance education about the economics of angling, conservation, culture in Oregon, and community? How do we sort of address all of that as we work toward education? So that's kind of the issue that we're addressing at the top. When you go down to the orangish red boxes, these boxes identify all of the specific areas I just went through that we think could be addressed by discussing what a balanced education program would look like. So if you all get together and talk about a balanced education program, you could address the sustainability of fish and fishing. You could address trust and transparency. You could address some of the concerns you have about costs and benefits and how those are talked about, and balancing fishing economics and conservation concerns. Then when you get down to the bottom, this is the beginning, and I want to sort of double click on beginning. These are broad ideas that we heard in the interviews from folks that are the beginnings of what you could talk about in your coming meetings and smaller groups as ideas that could be used. So we heard about using hatcheries as education centers for fish, ecosystems, and ODFW's work. We heard about cross-sector external novel partnerships, which certainly could play a role in any sort of education programming. We heard a call to expand volunteer programs and outreach staffing for hatcheries. And we heard a request for more storytelling and communication about the role that hatcheries play in Oregon, and also about the ecosystems in Oregon and how they're impacted by hatcheries. So the idea here is just to show you how we're thinking about using your ideas and then building them out. So in a small group, we would envision a conversation about what a cross-sector, external novel partnership would look like. What kind of partnerships are we talking about? With whom? Is there money associated with those partnerships? How would it help the statewide system? So that's what we hope to do next step. We have one more example for you of how this works. Modernizing hatchery operations. So again, that was a shared, I think, understanding that some hatchery operations need modernizing. There's of course a difference of opinion about the scope of that or the specific hatcheries that should be focused on, but modernizing to address climate change is certainly a topic that we heard from both sides. We think modernizing hatchery operations, discussing ideas for that, will address these 3 boxes in the orange and red color. And then the blue circles are the ideas that we have, that we heard from you about starting these conversations. Is that a comment? Okay. So ideas we heard: more monitoring to adapt struggling programs, promoting hatcheries as community assets, more partnerships, private hatchery partnerships like STEP, leveraging public-private partnerships, lowering fish densities at some facilities, developing climate resilient brood stocks. These were all sort of ideas that we heard throughout the interview process that we think could be a starting point for conversation between the groups. Let's look at the slide here. And I'm going to start at the top. So you've heard Sean now a couple of times explain the conversation that's going on between the agency, ODFW, and the legislature. That conversation is going both directions, with the legislature providing funding to the agency, and the agency in turn providing its report back to the legislature, which is the ultimate sort of deliverable, I'll say, for the agency out of this process, along with its infrastructure blueprint. So you see the infrastructure blueprint there is a product that the agency is creating in addition to its report. And then you see ODFW policy and planning kind of off to the side, because the idea is the infrastructure blueprint will impact ODFW policy and planning into the future. Tribes and the agency are in their own conversations, government to government conversations. And then ODFW has let some contracts and is engaged in activity with third parties who are doing the assessments. You heard about the 7 contracts. And public engagement, that's where Willamette Partnership comes in and you all come in. And then we're using this process to work together to make recommendations that will inform the infrastructure blueprint, right? That's kind of how we picture the process in our minds and the various steps of the process. I suppose one thing we've talked about a few times and we haven't depicted here is where the tribe's input will become known to the interested parties working together to make recommendations. And we've heard that that's a desire out of this group, and we'll talk about it and figure that out. Okay. we're going to get to a next step slide. Yep, here we go. That sort of shows specifically what we have slated. So we have the 3 informational webinars. These are going to be the report out from the contractors doing the assessments for the agency on August 1st, August 8th, August 15th from 12 to 1. So over the lunch hour, in hopes that that increases participation. Those webinars will be recorded and can be viewed later as people have time, and those recordings will be posted on the website. So all of that is available for public consumption. And then public meeting 2 will be in person the week of August 26th. We're going to start nailing down a date for that meeting just as soon as we can following this meeting. And that will be like the meeting you see here, though I would anticipate maybe largely in person with a little bit more notice and a little bit more time for discussion. And then we expect small group working meetings to come out of the second public meeting. And we don't have the dates for those yet, but that will be the following step for September and October. So this is the public process that we're referring to, and this is how folks can get engaged. This is what we're planning to use. And again, look at the website, because other things you will see there, for example, will be the Q&A from this session will be all written up with the questions and the answers, and that's available to anyone who's interested in looking at it.